Today we're going to study uh, um, a little bit about kettle lakes, how they're formed, and how 15,000 years ago Puyallup Glacier Lake burst, and it formed kettle lakes in Lakewood and the Spanaway area, and also in the Kapowsin area. First of all, if you look back 15,000 years ago, this is what took place. When the glacier from Puget Sound melted back to this spot in Tacoma, the glacier that was forming in the Puyallup Valley had melted, and when that glacier for Puget Sound moved and left an opening, the Puyallup Glacier burst, and they call that a Jokulop, and that is a Iceland word for sudden burst of a glacier lake. And this is how all these kettle lakes formed. Ice shot down over in the Lakewood area, Spanaway area, and also in the Kapowsin area. And then what happened was, this is what it looked like. And they had like an iceberg that was dirty. The icebergs aren't clean and white, they're dirty. They have a lot of rocks and things. And it created those striations that you see in this picture here. Kind of like if you followed 512, you'd see where a lot of those glacier things, actually further closer to Tacoma, created those grooves. Striations are grooves, and the rocky material and the glaciers themselves, when they got pushed south from the Jokulop, then it created all those striations. We need to kind of cover some of these words. Striated means those lines and grooves. Jokulop is the sudden burst of a glacier. Are you familiar with those words?
No.
Are you familiar with striated?
No.
Okay. And what about Jokulop?
That's a no one.
Okay. What about glacier?
I know glacier.
And glacial lakes?
Yep.
And what about kettle lakes?
Yep.
Okay. So why don't we write down those words so we can kind of take a look at it and just write a brief description. Try to write it in a small thing.
Of each word?
Yeah,
Oh, like
striated.
just showing the definition?
Yeah.
Okay.
Striated. Can you say it?
Striated.
Striated. What about Jokulop?
Jokulop.
Yeah, Jokulop. Yeah, Jokulop. And you know glacier, right? Can you say glacier?
Glacier.
And what about glacial lake?
Glacial lake.
And what about kettle lakes?
Kettle lakes.
Okay. Then if you write those out, like striated is parallel lines or grooves.
Okay, so parallel grooves.
Parallel lines, just like that's a parallel line.
Yeah.
These are parallel
So
lines.
parallel grooves in the sediment then, like.
Yeah, in the landform.
Grooves.
And the Jokulop is a sudden burst of a glacial lake.
Okay.
And it is an Iceland name. It describes the geology world has adopted that to use for a sudden burst of a glacial lake.
Okay.
And you know glacier. Glacier is a large sheet of ice and snow. Usually it's 200 feet deep at least, 200 feet wide at least, and about 500 foot long is the low end of glaciers and size-wise. In this case, they believe that probably the glaciers were probably somewhere around 1,000, 1,200 feet. Pretty large. Then Kettle Lake, just like it spelled, Kettle Lake.
Okay, but Glacier Lake is just like this.
A lake that's formed behind a glacier. It's formed from the glacier melting. It's a real common sort of an affair when there's glaciers and they melt. You usually have a lake. And then we have Kettle lakes, and we're going to go into detail on how Kettle lakes are formed.
Okay.
So anyway, this is what, with that glacier filling that whole valley, that's what it looked like 1,500 years ago in Puyallup. And then we're going to look at the Kettle lakes, what a Kettle lake, how a Kettle lake forms. So initially it shot out those big chunks of ice, and they're real big, lake size, like American Lake, like Lake Spanaway. They're huge chunks. Then as the glacier melts, it's what you call an outwash, and all that sediment forms around. It can even bury those great big chunks of ice.
Oh, wow.
Then as it melts further back, the depression is where the lake forms. And if there's enough rainfall, if there's enough water coming in through the bottom, infiltrating, the lake stays a lake.
Wow.
And those are what you call Kettle lakes. Remember how big they are, though. Remember how big Lake Kapowsen was? Even some of those smaller lakes, we notice. And this is how it's a real common thing, and how Kettle lakes form.
So Kapowsen was
Yeah.
formed by a kettle lake?
Yeah, it was a southern lobe of the Puyallup Valley. There was an iceberg lobe that went down and filled all that.
Oh, wow.
All these were formed by chunks, fairly large chunks of the glacier, and that is Kapowsen.
Wow. So that's how all the smaller lakes are formed?
Right.
By kettle.
Yeah. Kettle formation. If
kettle
there was a glacier in that area, there are other ways, and here we see Kapowsen Lake, which we visited, and I think that, I don't know if that's Kivo or Crystal or whatever.
Wow.
Then in the Lakewood area, and in Spanaway, you have Lake Spanaway, you have American Lake. So the glaciers left big chunks. American Lake is huge, and it left a big chunk there. So that is our lesson on Kettle lakes. That's how Kettle lakes are formed.
Wow.
So that'll be the end of our lesson. Do you have any questions?
No.
Okay. So you know what Kettle lakes are now.
Yeah.
And you know how they're formed. And this all started taking place about 15,000 years ago.
Wow.
20,000 years ago, the glacier went all the way past Olympia, where your aunt and uncle lived out there in Rochester, or Rochester, Little Rock. It went that far. The Mima Mounds were the very end of it, and as it melted, as the moon traveled, and as the tides went in and out, they just went around and formed those little circles around, and they think that's how the Mima Mounds were formed.
Wow.
So that's the end of our lesson today.
Okay.